Welcome to the Network Plus Prepcast, your dedicated audio companion for mastering every objective on the CompTIA Network Plus certification exam. This series is produced by baremetalcyber.com. In episode 144, we focus on one of the most fundamental and widely applied principles in cybersecurity, controlling access. Whether you're securing a small office network or an enterprise-grade infrastructure, the ability to define and enforce who can do what is key to protecting systems, data, and resources. The principle of least privilege and its practical application through role-based access control are essential tools in that mission. For Network Plus candidates, these concepts appear frequently on the exam and are foundational to securing both devices and users. Access control isn't just about limiting permissions, it's about limiting potential damage. Whether that damage comes from a malware infection, an accidental misconfiguration, or a malicious insider, the fewer privileges a user or device has, the lower the risk. Least privilege and RBAC are used to reinforce other security layers, including segmentation, encryption, and policy enforcement. They apply to everything from user accounts and admin interfaces to configuration settings and file access. This episode will help you understand how these controls work, why they matter, and how they're tested on the exam. The principle of least privilege states that users, services, or processes should have only the minimum access rights necessary to perform their assigned tasks, nothing more, nothing less. A user who needs to read reports should not have access to edit system settings. An administrator might need to configure routers but doesn't necessarily need access to firewall rules. By limiting permissions to only what is required, organizations reduce the chance that a compromised account or misused credential can be used to escalate access or cause widespread damage. On the exam, this principle is often referenced in questions involving user roles, device access, or configuration settings. The benefits of least privilege are extensive. First, it reduces the chance of mistakes. Users are less likely to accidentally delete or change something critical if they don't have the rights to do so. Second, it limits the reach of malware or compromised accounts. If an attacker gains access to a non-privileged account, their ability to move laterally or escalate permissions is severely limited. Third, it simplifies auditing. Tracking and reviewing activity is easier when permissions are clearly defined and limited. The Network Plus exam frequently includes scenario questions that ask you to apply least privilege to prevent or mitigate specific risks. Implementing least privilege requires a deliberate and structured process. Access should be assigned based on job function or business need, not based on convenience or default settings. Accounts and permissions should be reviewed regularly to ensure they still reflect the user's role. Where possible, automation can help assign permissions through templates, role mapping, or integration with identity systems. The more automated the process, the less risk there is of privilege creep, where users gradually accumulate more access than they need. On the exam, be prepared to identify how access reviews and job-based assignments uphold least privilege. Role-based access control, or RBAC, is a model used to implement least privilege efficiently. Instead of assigning permissions directly to users, you assign them to roles, collections of permissions that reflect specific job responsibilities. Users are then added to roles based on what they need to do. For example, instead of assigning firewall access to a user directly, you assign it to the network administrator role. If that user changes jobs, you simply remove them from the role. On the exam, expect to define RBAC and recognize its structure in comparison to other models. Roles in an RBAC system should be clearly defined and mapped to organizational functions. Typical roles include administrator, network analyst, auditor, help desk technician, or guest user. Each role has specific rights. An administrator might have full access to all network devices, while a guest user might only be able to connect to Wi-Fi. These definitions ensure consistency and reduce the risk of ad hoc permission assignment. The exam may ask you to identify how roles enforce least privilege or to select the appropriate role for a given user in a scenario. It's also important to understand how RBAC differs from other access models. Attribute-based access control, or ABAC, uses user attributes like department, time of day, or device type to determine access. While ABAC offers more dynamic and granular control, RBAC is simpler to implement and more commonly used in network environments. On the Network Plus exam, you should be able to compare RBAC with ABAC and choose the appropriate model for specific access control situations. RBAC is used to control permissions across the network, including access to VLANs or subnets, management interfaces, file shares, and configuration consoles. A technician might only have rights to access switch configurations on one subnet, while an engineer might have broader access across multiple segments. Access controls can also limit who can log into which device types, what commands they can issue, or whether they can apply configuration changes. On the exam, you'll need to evaluate scenarios where RBAC is applied to control network access effectively, and if allowed to onboard every patient, who does. Periodic access review is critical to maintaining an effective least privilege and RBAC implementation. Over time, users change roles, responsibilities shift, and systems are replaced or updated. Without regular reviews, permissions become outdated, leaving users with more access than they need. This is known as privilege creep. Regular audits identify unused roles, excessive rights, or inactive accounts that should be removed. These reviews also satisfy regulatory requirements and support internal accountability. The exam may include questions about how to detect privilege creep or when to schedule access reviews. Logging and monitoring access usage complements access control by providing visibility into how permissions are actually used. If a user accesses systems they shouldn't, or accesses permitted systems in unexpected ways, logs can identify that behavior. These logs can be correlated with assigned roles to detect anomalies, such as a guest user attempting to log into an administrative console. Logging also supports forensic analysis and ongoing risk assessment. On the exam, expect to see scenarios that involve correlating access logs with roles, or using monitoring to enforce policy. For more cyber content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Applying the principle of least privilege to devices goes beyond user account restrictions. It includes system-level access as well. This means limiting command line interface access or graphical interface access to only what is necessary. For example, a network technician might have read-only access to router settings, while a senior engineer has permission to make changes. It also includes disabling unused ports, interfaces, and services on devices to reduce the potential for abuse or misconfiguration. Separating user accounts from administrative accounts ensures that daily activities don't occur with elevated privileges. On the exam, expect questions about hardening device access and how to implement least privilege at the system level. Using groups to manage roles and permissions is a practical way to implement RBAC at scale. Instead of configuring access manually for each user, organizations use directory services such as Active Directory or LDAP to assign users to groups that reflect job roles. These groups inherit permissions automatically across systems, ensuring consistency and reducing administrative overhead. For example, the Network Ops group might have access to switch management interfaces, while Security Audit has read-only access to logs. This approach also simplifies onboarding and offboarding. The exam may include scenarios where group membership is the key to managing access rights across a distributed environment. Many network devices support role-based access directly. Firewalls and routers often allow the creation of user profiles with varying access levels, such as admin, operator, or read-only. Management platforms and central configuration systems also support RBAC, allowing organizations to enforce access controls across multiple devices at once. Network Access Control, or NAC systems, can dynamically assign access rights based on a user's role or endpoint status, further extending the RBAC model into the real-time operational environment. The exam may test your familiarity with which devices or systems support RBAC enforcement and how access profiles function. Multi-factor authentication, or MFA, strengthens privileged access by requiring a second form of verification beyond the password. This might include a mobile app, hardware token, or biometric scan. MFA is particularly important for administrative accounts that can change system configurations, manage users, or access sensitive data. Even if credentials are compromised, the attacker won't be able to proceed without the second factor. For exam purposes, be prepared to explain how MFA reinforces least privilege by ensuring only legitimate users can access high-level roles or perform sensitive operations. Least privilege also prevents a wide range of threats. Insider misuse, whether intentional or accidental, is much harder when users don't have access to critical systems. Malware that infects a limited account won't be able to escalate privileges or modify system settings. Lateral movement by attackers, jumping from one system to another, is slowed or blocked when access is segmented and restricted. By confining users and processes to specific predefined areas, organizations create containment zones that limit damage during a breach. The examiner may ask which threats are mitigated by applying least privilege and how these restrictions support broader security goals. Access control is also a compliance requirement in many regulated environments. Standards like HIPAA, PCI DSS, and ISO 27001 mandate the use of least privilege and RBAC to demonstrate proper user and data protection. Auditors will look for documentation of access policies, evidence of role assignments, and logs that show who accessed what and when. Organizations that fail to implement these controls may face fines, sanctions, or reputational harm. On the exam, you'll need to match these practices to compliance goals and understand how RBAC supports audit readiness. RBAC is a frequently tested concept on the Network Plus exam. You'll be expected to define RBAC, compare it with models like ABAC or DAC, discretionary access control, and identify scenarios where each model is appropriate. You may be presented with a table showing roles and permissions and asked to interpret what a user can or cannot do. Alternatively, you may be asked to choose the correct access model for a business requirement or troubleshooting scenario. Knowing how RBAC works in practice helps you answer these questions with confidence. To summarize, least privilege is a security principle that limits access to the minimum necessary, and RBAC is a method for implementing that principle in a structured, scalable way. Together, they reduce the risk of unauthorized access, support accountability, and simplify the enforcement of access policies. Whether applied to users, devices, or processes, these controls are essential for protecting networks against both internal and external threats. They also support compliance and ensure systems remain manageable as organizations grow and change. To conclude episode 141, remember that access control is not just about security. It's about precision. Least privilege limits risk by ensuring users only do what they're authorized to do. RBAC simplifies this process by tying access to roles, not individuals. These models help create a network environment that is both secure and scalable. For Network Plus candidates, this knowledge is essential for answering exam questions and implementing real-world access strategies that protect users, data, and systems effectively. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Network Plus Prepcast, your trusted audio guide to the CompTIA Network Plus certification. This episode was produced by baremetalcyber.com. For more cybersecurity podcasts, books, and resources, visit baremetalcyber.com. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cybersecurity Plus podcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com. And before you take the test, make sure to check out the practice questions in the book Achieve CompTIA Security Plus SY0-701 Exam Success by Dr. Jason Edwards. They cover every domain and are a powerful way to lock in your knowledge.